Hello, I'm Senator Ben Cardin. Welcome to Facebook Live, an opportunity I take advantage of every once in a while to bring some real experts to this media forum to be able to talk about a timely issue, to get their views, and to really have a conversation about an issue that is pending in the United States Senate. So today on Facebook Live, we're going to talk about Earth Day preview, climate action, and pathways to a clean energy economy. I'm very pleased to have really two experts on the subject of climate change. Starla Yeh, who is the director of the Policy Analysis Group, Climate Clean Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Dr. Nate Hultman, director of the Center of Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. So I've got two people who really understand the challenges of climate change. But I sort of want to go back, I guess, 5.5 years ago. I had the honor to lead a delegation of 10 United States senators to the meeting in Paris of the United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP21. It was an historic opportunity because we had had several of these United Nations conferences that really did not lead to a consensus as to what the international community needed to do to deal with the challenges of climate change. But that changed in Paris, and it changed with the leadership of the Obama administration in putting forward a way in which we could get universal acceptance of our responsibilities as a global community to change our behavior on Earth to deal with minimizing the damage caused by climate change. And we adopted a nationally determined contribution for each country as to what they could do. And it was individually determined, but there was collective pressure to make sure that every nation did what it should do. And I think that was the high watermark. We were all feeling so proud of that accomplishment. Then, of course, during the last 4 years, we've seen under the Trump administration, the United States pull back from the international leadership, withdraw from the Paris agreements. And US leadership has really been lacking in regards to dealing with the impact of climate change. So I want to start our discussion and ask each of our guests, how urgent is the issue today? How dangerous are circumstances? I can point in my own state of Maryland to two 100-year floods within less than 2 years in Ellicott City, Maryland. Now, we don't know the exact reasons why that occurred, but we're seeing extreme weather in Maryland and throughout the nation. I can point to our coastal lines and see the loss of wetlands as a result of sea level rises, and the loss of literally habitable land is no longer habitable, and the risk of flooding. So how much of this is related to the carbon emissions, to climate change, and how much of this can we really control here on Earth? Let me start, if I might, with Starla Yeh. If you could just start us off on this discussion, and then I want to get to the actions that we can take in the administration and in Congress.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you so much for having me today. You are absolutely correct. Climate change is a constant and present issue for us. We're all experiencing the effects of it, from flooding to wildfires, and events like this that are increasing in intensity and costing society enormous amounts of money, and increasingly so year after year. We know that these impacts are here and now. We don't need to wait any longer to see them and experience them. The good thing is that we know that there are also solutions that we have. The Biden administration and Congress have the tools that they need to be able to address these issues. And it will be critical that in the next 4 years, we move swiftly and take strong action across our economy to make sure that we are addressing the emissions that we can, and finding the solutions and technologies and innovation that will help us address those harder to decarbonize parts of the economy. It's an urgent need. The good news is that we have the solutions.
So just tell me briefly about the organization that you are the director of, the Policy Analysis Group. Tell me a little bit about what your mission is.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So Natural Resources Defense Council is an environmental organization that focuses on resolving and finding solutions to address the climate crisis. It is made up of a number of programs. The program that I am a part of is called the Climate and Clean Energy Program, and our emphasis and focus is climate policy at the federal, state, and local level in some cases. The Policy Analysis Group, which is the team that I oversee, is a team of about 6 or 7 analysts, and we are responsible for evaluating the economic and public health impacts of the various proposals that we see at the various levels, and also figuring out ways that NRDC can support them, and also designing policy approaches that NRDC sees as the most valuable and viable.
Well, thank you for that. That's critically important. You know, over the last several decades, we've passed major environmental laws in Washington, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and each one of those require that type of analysis, that what we do in order to regulate for clean air, what we regulate for clean water, we want to make sure that it's cost effective, that the economic benefits are there. So your analysis becomes so important as we make decisions based upon best science, but also what is practical to do in our economy. So thank you for connecting those dots. It becomes pretty important for us. Dr. Hultman, first of all, you're a Terp. Always good to have University of Maryland represented here today. So thank you for your leadership in our state. I know you were involved with the Obama administration and the Council on Environmental Quality as we developed our national determined contributions. So tell us a little bit about background there. How urgent is the issue? How important is it for us to do the maximum amount to reduce the greenhouse gas issues?
Well, let me add my thanks to you, Senator, for inviting us and getting this great conversation going, and also just sharing the excitement that you have about the opportunities we have at hand at this moment. So I think looking forward to digging into that today. You asked the question about the urgency. Starla gave a couple of really good examples of urgency, and I'll give a slightly different way to think about it. We know from the science that in order for us to keep the risks of climate change to a somewhat manageable level, they'll never be zero anymore because we've already made a difference, unfortunately. But to keep the risks to a safer level, we need to get global emissions of greenhouse gases to something close to zero by the middle of the century. And that implies rapid and transformative action in the economies of countries around the world, including our own country in the United States and our own state of Maryland. In large part, those transformations will be positive and will throw off lots of benefits in terms of jobs and health, and as Starla said correctly, avoided climate change, where we don't have to deal with those really severe risks. But if you think about getting from here to there, you can think about, for example, 2030, a decade from now, being a waypoint of progress where we need to get from today to 2030 to then net zero in 2050. And we know that even in the US, we have to get to roughly half of our, cut our emissions roughly in half by 2030 to get on a pathway to that successful strategy to mid-century. And what that really implies is, as I think Starla also mentioned, is that it's time to roll up our sleeves and get that job done. The good news there, I'm going to echo Starla's comment here. Not only do we have those technologies available, but also it's really important to recognize we're already on that path. We have already started that transition. Even in the last few years, when I know it's been, there's been regression at from the executive branch, there's been a story of increasing and increasingly ambitious action from the states, cities, businesses, and other organizations across this country. And so we're already moving that direction, and the time is really ripe for the federal government, from Congress and the presidency, to re-engage and then drive us forward to success.
So tell me about the group that you had, the Center for Global Sustainability. Tell me a little bit about that organization.
Sure. I'll tell you a little bit. So I'm happy to talk about it. So we're based very proudly at the State University of Maryland, the University of Maryland. We're in the College Park campus. Um, this center that I direct was founded. I started it up a few years back after I got back from the administration, the Obama administration, and the job that we have given ourselves is to help our state, help the country, and help globally to better understand the opportunities for action and to work with our policy community to help build confidence that the bold steps that are needed to get to success are actually within our grasp, and they're possible. So we look at subnational climate strategies. We look a lot at national climate strategies, such as the one the United States is now grappling with in the next couple of weeks, and also thinking about how those strategies integrate internationally as well.
So I'm going to go back to 2015 first, and we established the standards of a nationally determined contribution, where each country agreed to do certain things to meet the goals that you referred to. As I understand it, your role within the Obama administration was to deal with what was realistic for the United States to agree to, and I guess evaluate what other countries were agreeing to do. Is that a fair, and in the context of the United Nations Conference of Parties on trying to bring the global community together?
So that's absolutely right. And I think it's really important that, you made this point, Senator, at the very beginning of our conversation today, that there are two dimensions of what happens to address this problem globally. One is the dimension of what happens internationally. How do we coordinate ourselves? How do we understand actions that we're taking in the US? How does that understood from countries outside the US? How do we understand the actions that others are taking? It's really important, I think, as we all recognize, because this is a global problem, we have to be able to coordinate our efforts toward a common goal. And the Paris Agreement, as you noted, is a critical part of organizing that effort. At the same time, all of the decisions and all of the individual targets that are made are based in national policy making and national strategies. So they're targets and their strategies that countries themselves come up with, which what makes sense for them. And the US in 2014, when I was part of that team, and now today, as the Biden team is working on this very, very doggedly, I think, over the last couple of weeks, is looking at the same question. What makes sense for us in the United States to do? What's going to be beneficial for the citizens of this country? How should we best advance that action in terms of specific kinds of policies maybe from Congress, maybe from the executive branch, maybe from subnational actors as well? And then what do those actually add up to? And so the work I was involved in was basically doing similar kind of work, but just at a different moment. We had a little bit less possibility of action at that time. And so I think it's important to recognize that the world has changed quite dramatically, and we're really at a moment now where the opportunities are greater.
So, Starla, President Biden, in a pretty ambitious move, on March 26, he had been president for a little over 2 months, decided to invite the leaders of the industrial world, the major producers of greenhouse gas, 17 countries, to join him in a summit on this very issue, Leaders Summit on Climate, scheduled for April 22nd and 23rd. What should we expect in regards to that summit?
At the summit, I'm hoping to see some real ambition and some real leadership from President Biden and his administration in setting a strong target for the U.S. that's ambitious but achievable, and promises to deliver economic and public health benefits to Americans, and especially communities of color and low-income and disadvantaged communities. NRDC just published a report recently talking about the ways in which that can happen. We evaluated a 53% reduction, so this is very much in line with the at least 50% target. And we found that there are many opportunities across all of these sectors of the economy to reduce emissions consistent with that goal that would generate benefits for Americans everywhere, lower electricity bills, increase public health. So this is what we're looking for in particular at the summit, is strong leadership from the US, which will hopefully inspire strong global leadership as well.
I believe the report that you're referring to, which was issued by your organization, dealt with economy-wide decarbonization by the mid-century. Tell me what that would mean. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So we focused mostly on the 2020 to 2030 decade. So we haven't quite reached the mid-century point yet. But we, as I said, we did evaluate a more than half reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we found that we can achieve that level. There are like familiar decarbonization measures that we can take to do that. And those are things like making sure that our electricity consumption is as efficient as it can be. That applies in our homes and our businesses, with our vehicles and in industry, and in our commercial buildings as well. We can make sure that we are doing the most that we can to electrify vehicles and electrify space heating and water heating in buildings, rather than using fossil gas-based systems. We can make sure that we are growing our sales of electric vehicles and trucks. So it's a recipe that includes familiar measures that we know we can do, that are tried and true, that we really just need to scale up. We have also found that in the range of policy approaches that we evaluated, for every one policy option that we put out there, there's a range of others as well. And this is really encouraging for us, because for all of the literature that exists now, and there have been several reports that have come out in the past couple months, there are different approaches to taking on this kind of a target. And each of them basically has a kind of changed couple of things here and there on the policy approaches. And the encouraging thing about that is that means that there's optionality for us. There's not just one thing. And it also means to me that this is not like the highest bound. This is not the only thing that can get us there. So that flexibility is really important, because it means that this target is feasible, it is achievable, and there's no reason that the administration, combined with all of the resources and options available through Congress, should not take action.
Well, I certainly agree with you. It's not going to be one step that will get us to our goal. We're going to have to do a multifaceted attack on the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon emissions. One goal that has been stated frequently is to have an economy where 100% of our electricity is generated through clean energy sources. So, Nate, is that doable by 2035? I think is the goal, to have 100% clean electric produced energy, I guess in the next 14 years. Can we do that?
So we can do that. It's going to take, as you were just saying, it would take a lot of different steps from a lot of different actors, and making sure that we're starting now and continuing to do that work over the coming 14 years. But it's absolutely possible. It's technologically possible. The costs for those technologies have dropped precipitously in the last, the clean technologies have dropped precipitously in the last decade or so. So we're looking at options that are absolutely, as Starla laid out in her excellent report, options that are cost effective, they're clean, they provide public health benefits, and getting to 2035, 100% clean, that's doable. It's a challenge, but we're in America, we can do that. The other thing I would note is that also puts us on a really good path, as we're linking back to that question of what's our national climate target and what's the strategy. If we're setting a 2035 100% clean goal, that puts us on a good trajectory to hit a very good 2030 goal as part of that discussion with the international community as well.
So there's, please.
I'm sorry, can I build on that for one moment?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
I told you all to interact, and then I interrupted you. I'm sorry, please.
No, not at all. I was just going to pick up on the point that the 2030 positioning is critical. And it really is. Not only is it critical from an international standpoint, as Nate just said, but it's also critical in terms of making sure that we are minimizing the costs of the transformative change that we need throughout our economy. So there are several studies out there which are showing that if you don't hit these strong 2030 targets, that the costs of getting to cleaner outcomes post 2030 can be multiplied by several orders of magnitude. So it is really critical to make sure that we are keeping the pressure on and making sure that we are taking action swiftly, decisively now in this decade.
So what I want to point out, there's two ways we can do this. We can use less energy and therefore less emissions, and we can get our energy from cleaner sources. So we have two ways to really reach our goals. So I want to get some advice from you all. I have the honor of chairing the infrastructure subcommittee on the Environment and Public Works Committee. So I'm going to be looking to put together with my colleagues a transportation policy for this country that will invest hundreds of billions of dollars, literally, in a more modern transportation infrastructure. And we'll be dealing with not just our highways and roads and bridges and transit, but rail and the whole gamut approach. And also at the same time, looking at ways that we can make our transportation infrastructure friendlier to modes of transportation that can use renewable energy sources rather than the traditional petroleum products. So, what advice do you have for me? If you were the staff for the committee or you were the senator, what would you look for as giving us the best opportunities to reach these goals through our transportation system? Well, I'll have to call one of you. Who wants to volunteer to help me on that one?
Why don't I start and then Starla, you're definitely going to have some additions because I know you've thought a lot about this. So so first of all, what an opportunity, because really right now we're at a moment where we know we need to rebuild. There's a lot of infrastructure that's in need of repair, and our communities are in many of them desperate need of new investment. And in transportation links, and many communities are underserved. And so the question is, how do we layer multiple goals into one sort of strategy? And that's the exciting opportunity, because we can, I think, hit a few different goals with a concerted and well-structured effort. Some of that, I think, is really important to think about, putting us on that longer-term pathway to success for the 2050 timeline. And then part of the question, Senator, was what gets us the most bang for the buck today? And so sometimes we have to think of pursuing both of those at the same time. So I don't have the full exhaustive list, which I'm sure your staff have, but basically a few things that I've noticed from some of the work we've been doing and would potentially be very beneficial. We've done a couple of our studies as well. Like Starla said, a lot of these studies show multiple pathways to success for an overall ambitious U.S. climate strategy. But one of the themes that comes out, not only of our studies, but I think of others, is for sure the electrification of vehicle transportation, which Starla did mention. But just to kind of double down on that requires obviously investment in infrastructure for charging. And it also sometimes requires cities and states to be engaged in partnering with the federal government, because often they have dimensions of jurisdiction over that set of questions. And so that's an interesting opportunity, a good opportunity for us to be working together across those different levels of government. The other dimension, of course, is what we can do to accelerate the adoption of these electric vehicles. And so that's something that, for example, different kinds of tax incentives can be very valuable in encouraging that change. And one of the studies we've done shows that there's actually quite a big amount of additional action we can see out of the transportation sector if Congress does support EV incentives in some ways that really help us get to that more ambitious 2030 number. So that's really critically important. The other thing I'll say, and just keep it really brief, is the broader question you also raised about other modes of transportation and intermode, to use the term, linkages. But that means also making our public transportation and train systems more accessible and more feasible to use for kind of regular people that might not live necessarily right close by right now, but to make those access points more readily available. And that allows people to use those transportation modes more efficiently and more effectively, and that can help also with our climate goals as well. But I'm sure, Starla, what else is on the list?
I think you covered it well, Nate. Absolutely in agreement that access and ensuring access to technologies and infrastructure is critically important. We really see that as a key piece of the puzzle here. But I think the main factors are infrastructure, technology, and costs, consumer behavior, and in a way, the turnover of the current vehicles and trucks that we're driving today, and through federal incentives and minimum targets for zero emission vehicle sales, we can accomplish and address most of these challenges.
Thank you for that. Let me just, we are working on the charging stations. That's something that we desperately need so that you can travel long distances on an electric vehicle without concern that you get stranded. That's something we are clearly including in the package. We're also looking at technology. The battery technology today is not only important for transportation, it's important for energy. If we're going to capture wind and solar, we need to have a better way of capturing and storing energy. And that's another form of technology that we are very much investing in. But let me just share with you, we had a very interesting hearing this week in the Environment and Public Works Committee on alternative revenue sources. And the mileage travel is becoming a very popular concept. There's pilot programs in several states right now that would look at how many miles you travel, and then you get charged for that based upon a user pay system. The pilot programs are all on commercial vehicles today, not on personal vehicles. But you could see how this could become the substitute for a gasoline tax if we're going to be with primarily electric fleet. If we need revenues, we have to figure out a different way to get revenues than through a gasoline tax. But I raised the point that we want to encourage efficiencies, and we don't want to penalize people for using a clean energy source because of the miles they travel is done efficiently, whereas someone may not travel as many miles, but it's not as efficient. So it's going to be a challenge as to how we get the right balance in our system of financing to encourage the use of renewable energy sources for transportation, but to do it in a way that we can get enough revenue to modernize our system. So it's going to be a tough balancing act. We're going to continue this discussion. I'm very proud that we have Starla Yeh, who's the director of the Policy Analysis Group at the Climate Clean Energy Program, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Dr. Nate Hultman, who's the director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. So President Biden's signature initiative is Build Back Better. Now, we've already finished the first chapter of Build Back Better with the American Rescue Plan. The president's announced his second part of his program as the American Jobs Plan, which is about a $2 trillion package for infrastructure. And he will shortly be announcing his American Family Plan, which invests in the human resource of this country. So as we look at Build Back Better, the president has said one of his goals is that this be part of our strategies and our international commitments to reduce carbon emissions, to build back a safer, stronger, and healthier environment. So where do we need to make the investments in order to utilize this opportunity that we have to invest in modernizing America, modernizing America's infrastructure, modernizing America's buildings? And how do we do that in a way that gives us the maximum advantage on dealing with our climate commitments. Dr. Hultman, I'll start with you.
Sure. So again, how great to have this opportunity in front of us with this, you know, strong backing from the president and support from you know, from Congress. There are a couple of ways to look at that question. So let me sort of note, like, I think a really essential part of this is sort of embedded in your question, is the point that we're no longer in a world where we're thinking about climate policy being something that's over there and the American economy being something that's over here and jobs being something that's, you know, over there. The right way to look at a climate strategy is really a strategy for the United States that gets us on a track toward a more vibrant economy with broadly shared benefits, as we were talking about just a few minutes ago with the transportation and infrastructure work. So that strategy building is really what I see is the vision under the Build Back Better idea, which is that yes, we are recovering. We've come out of a difficult period. We have opportunities on the horizon, and how best to grasp those. And part of thinking about that is how we build in climate benefits to the overall strategy that you've outlined here to get to the jobs and investing in our people. And so as we look at that from now the climate perspective, it's really good to be now integrating this across all of our thinking. It's not just a matter of one sector at a time. It's an integrated strategy about retooling the American economy toward one that's cleaner, low carbon, and healthy, and also vibrant, I should say. So it's also got, you know, jobs and economic benefits for regular Americans. And so that's the vision that's embedded. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do? What are the steps? And I think that this is again where there's actually, the point is that we have to be working honestly to get to the 2030 waypoint and the 2050 goal across all sectors and all gases. And that means a partnership across all of US society to make sure that this happens, working with the private sector as much as possible to understand what their opportunities are, working with different cities, states, and businesses and more. And what that means in practice is, let's take those really low-hanging fruit right now. Like, let's take the opportunities as they come. It turns out there are many across lots of different sectors. There's a lot in electricity sector, as we talked about a couple of times before. The clean energy opportunity is really good. We have very low cost renewable energy available today. You, Senator, mentioned the energy efficiency. That is often one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest option for reducing emissions, but it also provides lots of other long-term benefits to people in houses who are currently leaky. They save money on their bills by improving efficiency and other kinds of benefits like that. There's also job benefits that go along with building retrofits, for example, that are also really important as we're thinking about building sector strategies. There's low-cost strategies in agriculture and land sectors, and forestry and farming that can be also incorporated here, and bring in other parts of our economy that are also looking for new opportunities to engage in this overall strategy. So I would say that what we want to do now is sort of certainly look at the near-term low-cost opportunities, maximize those, and then importantly, make sure that we're not neglecting some opportunities that might be longer term. We might not have the technologies quite yet today, but be sure to invest in research and development to be sure that those technologies then are available through our innovative economy in years ahead when we have run out of these current opportunities to tap. But you know, Starla, I've only mentioned a couple there. There might be others you have in mind that I forgot.
Well, there are a whole range of them. But one of the things that I want to underscore, which I think we haven't quite talked about enough yet in the conversation about this opportunity that we're facing, is really the opportunity that all of this policymaking brings us to prioritize low-income communities. So one of the things that NRDC has focused on and learning more about and trying to think about more and incorporate into the kind of policy proposition and design process is how to make sure that we are reducing emissions and finding ways to benefit disadvantaged communities to the greatest extent possible. And I think we see all of these opportunities across the economy to decarbonize as opportunities to put these communities and their concerns at the forefront. So, for example, as we talk about economic growth, various studies have shown that economic growth could happen with these climate change strategies to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. And we want to make sure that in order to ensure that low-income communities and disadvantaged communities are capturing those benefits, that the emission reductions and the opportunities for jobs are happening in those communities and accessible to them as well. Same thing with the access conversation that we just had on the vehicle side. It's vitally important to ensure that the low-income communities are having as much or better access to that type of infrastructure as other communities are. But overall, I mean, I just really want to underscore the point that these investments and all of the changes that we have before us are really opportunities, and we should think about the ways in which economic growth can benefit all Americans, but especially those who have suffered the worst historical inequities.
Well, thank you for those points. You're absolutely right that there's a lot of savings that can be gotten beyond the traditional transportation and energy sectors, which are the two that get the most conversations when it comes to carbon reductions. Buildings are a major source of carbon emissions. And we have an aged inventory of buildings, a lot of under government control, I might say. I've introduced legislation on green federal buildings and introduced improvements to Section 179D of the Internal Revenue Code that will allow you to retrofit a home or business to be energy efficient. So there's a lot we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions from our building stock here in the United States. And then there's another favorite I have, and that is our water infrastructure. People don't see it. We waste so much energy in the way that we transport water for drinking and for treatment for wastewater. And we waste so much water and we waste so much energy because our system is so old. I usually brag about Baltimore City, which had the most modern water infrastructure in the world 100 years ago. Unfortunately, some of those pipes are still there today. So we really do need to modernize our water infrastructure, and that will make a major difference. But Starla, you're absolutely correct. We have to look at the impact on underserved communities. And thank you for mentioning that. Because when we look at the impact of climate change in the United States and around the world, we're all vulnerable. But the most vulnerable populations are those of low income, or those in minority communities. They're the most vulnerable. And as we look at building back better in the United States, we really do need to pay attention to those communities that have been left behind and make sure that what we do gives them a higher quality of life, but also as we implement these policies, we're mindful of the economic impact and affordability. And that was the second point I raised during the hearing on the mileage-based fees as to how it would impact on low-income individuals. So I think we have to look at both of those impacts as we move forward to modernizing the way that we deal with infrastructure and we deal with building our country back better for all. I want to touch on a point that we've talked about. It's so important that we modernize our infrastructure, our country, for so many reasons. For convenience of life, for competitiveness, for leadership, all that's important, that we have communities that reflect the technology that we know we have and the wealth that we should be investing for our future. But there's another reason, and that's U.S. leadership. We could do everything right in the United States, and we would still be very much negatively impacted by climate change if the global community does not provide the wherewithal to reduce carbon emissions. So how important is U.S. leadership from the point of view of climate diplomacy, and how important is for the United States to lead not just by its words, but by its deeds, if we're going to be able to meet our global responsibilities? Let me start first. This time, I think I'll start with Starla. I want to start with you, and we'll sort of rotate this.
Sure, thanks. So there are two factors here. One is the scientific imperative that we, as a global collective, need to reduce emissions to a certain level in order to be consistent with a 1.5 degree Celsius trajectory by the end of the century. That is largely agreed upon as like net zero by mid-century. The second question is, what are the contributions of each of the countries of the world to ensuring that that level materializes? And the second question is one that is, has more kind of subjectivity with respect to countries and how they're positioned, and what size their economy is and how much historically they have contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. The United States is the largest economy in the world and has contributed significantly, especially on a per capita basis, to the kind of global problem and the emissions that have occurred historically. So as a result of that, it is vital that the U.S. demonstrate leadership when it comes to addressing the potential impacts of climate and trying to avoid the worst impacts. So from that standpoint, it is essential that the U.S. Has a strong and ambitious target that the other countries of the world can look to as a point of inspiration when developing and considering their own NDCs.
Nate?
So Starla said it brilliantly. So let me do what I can to fill in some other sort of perspective on this. So absolutely, American leadership matters on climate change. It matters for a lot of reasons. Starla mentioned, it's the world's #1 economy. We're also the world's #2 emitter. So everything we do does, in fact, help the overall global success to get to kind of climate friendly trajectory that we've talked about a couple of times today. But that said, I think it's also critically important to recognize the point that Senator, you made, that the United States cannot do it alone. We are the second largest emitter, but China's bigger than us, and there's a lot of other countries that are emitting a lot right now as well. And so what that means is that we do have to be thinking about what we can do domestically, what makes sense for our economy to do, to be ambitious, to set a sort of a goal that will push us forward towards success in the United States, and in doing that, get our own house in order. And with our own house in order, we can hold our heads high and go in the international community, step up again, and work with key countries around the world, both partners and others around the world who are critical to success. And with our own house in order, with our own ambitious target, we can go to others and say, what are you going to do? How can we together work on helping the other countries around the world to get over the line toward climate success? And so that leadership has been missing. While there has been work happening across the country at the subnational level, we have been missing globally American leadership in this space. So it is now time. All the pieces are in place for the U.S. to step up, build off of this stepped up basis created by the subnational actors over the past few years, put an ambitious target on the table, go to the key leaders at President Biden's summit next week, and with them, state the intention and put some real results on the table to get to a successful outcome in 2021, as the international community is actually looking to this moment to raise global ambition toward getting a success on climate change and not just something that's happening in the US.
Dr. Hultman, let me share with you conversations I've had with my colleagues from other countries, fellow parliamentarians. I've met with them frequently on the climate issue. I've been at international meetings, including not just COP21, but other COP meetings that we've had a chance to interact and talk about it. And I've made the same point, and they've made the same point about U.S. leadership. I've made the point about what we have done and what we intend to do, and that we are prepared to take leadership. Even during these 4 years of the Trump administration, we stepped up and made commitments, and we carried out a lot of our commitments during those 4 years, where it was extremely challenging with the policies of the Trump administration. But what I will normally hear from my fellow parliamentarians, particularly in the developing world, is that it's nice for you to say that we need to conserve our environment after you have abused your environment and you have developed your country. So now you want us to have extra costs by preservation of our natural resources, our forests and our lands. You've already done all this. You're emitting a lot more than we are. Your economy is a lot stronger. So what are you going to do for us? And that normally is translated into assistance through a green fund or some other mechanism in order to compensate the developing countries for the misuse that we made of our environment during our growth years. That's not terribly popular in the developed world. Doesn't go over well with constituents here in the United States. Do we need to pay attention to that request?
So let me give a stab at that, and Starla, you might have a thought too. So here's the thing. That's certainly an argument we have heard over the decades from, there's been let's just be direct about this. There's been historically really up to around the Paris moment, there was a big split in the international community, developed countries, developing countries. And there was some sense that there had to be some staging where the developed countries would go first, the developing countries would come later. I think with Paris, I wouldn't say this is totally resolved, but there was a different phase of the discussion where it was recognized we are all in this together and that different countries will be acting in different paces and different rates, that definitely, international assistance will be part of the story. But largely speaking, that different countries with these national contributions will be thinking about what makes sense for their own development goals. And it turns out, because of the changes we've seen in technologies, the much lower cost for clean energy, this sort of clean energy, vibrant economy future that we keep talking about as part of a climate strategy, that future is also something that has been seen in India, in China, and a lot of other countries around the world. And in fact, they have not been standing still. There's actually been, all countries can, have to continue to take actions, but I think it's also correct to note that both India and China have taken on some dimensions of a clean energy transition pretty actively over the past few years. And that one of the jobs of countries around the world, including the United States, is to ensure that not only China and India, but other countries also have ability to realize that sort of future with a cleaner energy infrastructure. And we have a lot of mechanisms we've put in place over the decades, including the World Bank and others, to kind of support that kind of development trajectory. And if we think about the overall national climate strategies in the developing countries, and the least developed countries in particular, there's a lot that we can do as an international community to help them get to that future that in many ways they do want to get to. And it just is a matter of ensuring that there's access to the right markets and maybe some development collaboration there.
Starla, you want to add anything to that, to our responsibility here?
No, I think that was a brilliant way to put it. I guess the only addition might be that yes, assistance is critical, and I think we all would expect that to continue, and that to continue to be a part of the framework. But carbon emissions are global in impact, and they affect everyone. So any emission that comes out of the United States any ton of emissions that comes out of the United States is going to have impacts globally. There is a metric that's used in policymaking to measure this effect. And the Biden administration early on in its tenure had issued an executive order to ask the foremost scientists in the country to update the research on presenting this estimate and making sure that it is adequately accounting for all of the impacts of climate change. The hope is that that commitment will produce in the near future an estimate. It's called the social cost of greenhouse gases. But that technical term aside, its job is to represent the benefits of reducing emissions in an economic and monetary way. And the effect of having a higher one that is better representative of all of the costs of the and damages associated with greenhouse gas emissions is that policymaking can essentially go farther and be stronger because we know that the costs of emitting greenhouse gases are very high. And we want to account for those. And so I think the Biden administration is on track to doing that. That's something that will help the policies in this country be stronger and will help us work towards a stronger target that will, on a global scale, be hold us accountable, let's say, to the level of emissions that the United States has historically emitted.
Well, I want to thank both of you for those comments. I'll use some of those points when I meet with my friends from around the world. But, I serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the United States and the taxpayers of this country have recognized their global responsibilities. We are actively engaged in helping countries all over the world directly through our USAID foreign assistance programs, as well as through our participation in international economic and finance institutions. And each one of those are targeted towards the countries that are primarily developing countries. So we do make contributions to the global community to recognize our responsibility. So I think that really needs to be taken into consideration. Although I can tell you that the Green Fund is always brought up in these discussions. So we know we have a hurdle, and the issue will always be brought to us. You mentioned the subnational groups that have been very helpful. It's not just the governments themselves that have acted. We have the RGGI, our regional group that deals with environmental issues on energy production. And then I want to talk a little bit about private sector. I must tell you, I was so proud of our private sector leaders during these last 4 years and their active engagement in the international community on behalf of the United States. I said I was at COP meetings during the Trump years, and I can tell you America was there. Of course, we're still a member of the Paris Agreements. The effective date of actually leaving the Paris Agreements was the day that President Biden, or the day after President Biden was elected. So our private sector stepped up, not only with their verbal leadership, but with their actions. So how important is it that we have the subnational groups and we have the private sector all in the same wavelength as to a strategy on U.S. leadership, U.S. action, and global, realistic global responsibility to deal with climate? Who wants to go first on that one?
So I'll
build.
Looks like you're going first, Nate.
Okay. So this is an area that I think is extraordinarily exciting in the US and also globally. And if we think about how, again, the world is different today than it was 5 or 6 years ago, one of the critical changes that has happened, in addition to the technology costs dropping and some of the other ones we've mentioned, is that these other actors have genuinely stepped up. And I think that an essential part of any successful strategy, if we're looking back from 2050 and saying, how did we do it? What we're going to say is we didn't do it because there was just this one set of actors or just the federal government. We're going to say that we did it because everybody was in. And a critical part of that, of course, is the private sector. And I think it's a major change in global action, but also in the US over the last 4 or 5 years. There have always been some companies who have been visionaries and have been interested in, being advanced on new technologies and addressing climate. But that has broadened tremendously to the point where now it is largely, I wouldn't say universal, but there is a large component of our American private sector that's interested and already even taking commitments to address emissions even in their own operations. And so as we look at this kind of question of how does change happen in the United States? If we look at the last couple of decades, change often happens not from the top down. Change happens when you aggregate a lot of experiments and a lot of innovations across the private sector, across cities, states, and businesses, thinking about how those interact and how they kind of is sometimes called the laboratories of democracy, can sort of find new pathways of doing things. New innovations come online. We've seen a tremendous amount of activity and energy on that front over the last 4 years. What that does is it creates the moment today, because the private sector has been so forward leaning on this, where we actually have a broader base to do more in the US. And in fact, even globally, a number of countries are companies are coming forward with, for example, targets for net zero emissions. And that's been a big trend even over the last year or two. So there's lots of ways that there's been activity and action, and I think it's sort of certainly bodes well for the possibilities for this year.
One of the things that I've been most encouraged by recently is the progress and the momentum, especially in vehicle companies, to set targets for 100% zero emission vehicle. And it's been interesting to see that, even when those companies are not necessarily American car companies, they have manufacturing in this country. So that means that there are opportunities for job growth in the states where their factories are. And there are opportunities to make sure that people are getting better and or higher paying jobs. So things like that are encouraging steps forward. And as Nate said, there are lots of actors who are doing that, not just in the transportation sector, but across the economy. And there are global companies, American companies, that are doing the same thing. It's because they're recognizing the economics of it, and because they're recognizing the benefits of contributing to an economy where there are lesser and lesser emissions, and where there are opportunities for economic growth and large, substantial public health benefits to Americans and citizens all over the world.
There's also been another significant change in the landscape as it relates to our topic. Not only has there been a change in the White House, there's also a change in the leadership in the United States Senate, with the Democrats controlling the agenda rather than the Republicans. And that allows the Democratic president, who is sensitive on climate issues, to be able to get the schedule assignment for the Senate taking up agenda issues, including climate. I think that will have a major impact on what we're able to do as far as congressional support, which may come out in regards to appropriation bills, may come out in regards to specific climate bills, and may come out and Build Back Better, the components of that. And there's one additional thing that's happened, and that is the Clean Air Rule, which has been in litigation for a long time and in development for a long time. And President Trump's Clean Air Rule has now been sent back by the courts. So we have another opportunity in the original determination made that greenhouse gases are pollutants and need to be controlled. And we have a chance through regulation also, and with the Senate equally divided right now, but not controlled by the Republicans, the chances of sustaining these actions are certainly a lot better. So both of you said these are exciting times, and indeed they are exciting times. And I think we'll conclude on where we started, and that is the last 4 years is in the Congress. It's been defensive. I think these next 4 years are going to be ones in which we can see the United States initiating a lot of good policies that will help not only our economy and our environment, but America's leadership globally and make a difference on the activities we see in other states. So let me thank my two guests today for this fascinating discussion. The real experts have really helped us understand the challenges we have with climate change. Starla Yeh, who is the director of the Policy Analysis Group, Climate Clean Energy Program, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Dr. Nate Hultman, who is the director of the Center of Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. And thank you all for joining me on Facebook Live. We're going to do this again on a timely subject. It always gives me an opportunity to share with my constituents in Maryland a timely subject, and I really do thank both of our guests, and thank you all for viewing this.